In this week's Weather Extra, we're going to do a follow-up to the story that's airing on CBSN this week. As part of our commitment to climate change coverage, one of the stories we spotlighted this week is the devastating loss of kelp forests along our coast. Some of the work that's being done to save them and what the driving factors are behind this whole problem. And there's so much to the story that I'm going to delve into the details here that we could not in that initial story. If you haven't seen that initial story yet, you can find it on CBSN, and I'll also have links to it on my personal social media accounts, so you can kind of get the front end of this story. But here's some of the background information in addition to everything that we've already covered, and some of the important aspects about why the loss of the kelp forests off our coast is such a troubling sign of one more impact climate change is having on the ecosystems we all depend on so much. We're going to switch from looking at the pretty views of kelp to take a look at the Pacific Ocean from this summer, August 2021. This is a map that shows you how far above average the sea surface temperatures are, or how far below average. There's a little of that on here too. But it's the above average which stands out like a sore thumb. That deep red bullseye shows you a persistent area in the Pacific Ocean where sea surface temperatures were as much as 9 degrees above average for a prolonged period of time. That's something now called a marine heat wave, a significant part of that story, which we aired on KPIX this week and which is airing now on CBSN. Marine heat waves, though, require at least a little more information than I was able to delve into in that story. And I think the driving factor has to be, if we're seeing more marine heat waves, why are we seeing more marine heat waves? And there's a clear connection to climate change on that. I spoke with Professor Art Miller down at the Scripps Institute of Oceanography, who makes that first step link.
So the oceans are very good at basically pulling in a lot of the excess heat that is being trapped by the greenhouse gases in our atmosphere, the excess heat. So about 90% of that is being sequestered in the ocean.
That's a pretty staggering statistic. Most of the excess heat that our planet is now holding on to due to the greenhouse effect is getting stored in the oceans. But because the oceans are so much more dense than the atmosphere is, it takes a while for them to respond. It's also going to take a lot longer for that to reverse once they get going. Think of the momentum here. And if we keep that in mind, the next expert we're going to hear from, Professor Alex Sengupta, is focused on what we can expect to see from marine heat waves going into the future.
We're definitely looking at more frequent, more intense, longer heat waves going into the future. And in particular, the very extreme marine heat waves are going to increase in their sort of frequency.
So now we're going to get to the part about why this matters for this one item that we focused on this week, the kelp forests off our coast. If you take a look over here at the coastline of California, you can see a deep shade of blue out there. That is the California current. And this summer, when we were experiencing a pretty intense marine heat wave out here, the California current, thankfully, went into overdrive. And by that I mean it did what it does so well. It created a lot of upwelling along the coast of California, meaning all the cold water at depth was brought up to the surface, and it cooled the waters off our coast. This is one of the most important signatures about the climate here in California. This persistent pool of cold water right off our coast. It's the California current. It's one of the most dominating factors in why we have the climate that we have here. It's also crucially important for kelp forests because kelp forests need cold water, particularly the cold water that the California current is so good at delivering. I spoke with an expert on the California current, Andrew Lysing, who focuses on not only depicting the California current, but also helping us understand how it behaves. Here's what he had to say about its role in kelp.
And upwelling is really critical because that's a process whereby cold, nutrient-rich waters get pulled up to the surface right along the coast. And that's what feeds basically the whole food web. That's what makes our kelp able to grow.
Okay, here's the connection to this now. With the resurgence in the California current this summer, as strong as it was, that's about as strong as we typically ever see it. It really went into overdrive. We should have really seen a strong rebound in kelp off our coast this summer. Now, we did see an improvement in kelp off this summer. It was a very promising sign. But when you look at the statistics for how kelp rebounded this summer, we only got about 10% of what we should have seen in terms of the amount of kelp blooming and really just blossoming off our coast under a scenario like that. It doesn't get any better than this in terms of the environment that kelp likes and that it needs to thrive in. And even with a summer like that, there was a lot of hope because we did see the kelp start to grow back this summer. But the important statistic to that is it only came back at about 10% of what it would or should have under a situation like this. And here's the reason why. There is a growing population of purple urchin off our coast. And these have taken over primarily because the kelp were weakened. And as you'll see in the story if you watch it, one of their primary predators was wiped out about 6 years ago due to a pathogen. And then at the same time, we started experiencing these marine heat waves off our coast that weakened the kelp, and the urchin took over. The concern is the urchin have now taken over so much, it might not be possible to bring kelp back at all. Doesn't mean it has to go that way. And there are a lot of researchers doing work to help bring the kelp back, another thing that we spotlight in the story. But one of the things we didn't get to in the story is the first thing that needs to happen is we need to start removing the urchin if that's possible. And one of the people helping to lead that charge is Maria Brown, who is the superintendent for Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary. That is the protected zone of water off our coast. And she is working with a company called Urchinomics to do just that. I spoke with her as well.
One idea is there's a company such as Urchinomics who's taking these urchins, feeding them a proprietary feed, fattening them up, and then selling the uni. So it's a way of making a market for these purple urchins.
To inspire more people to get out there and
collect them.
So there's a lot to this story. A lot of pieces that have to come together just right. And of course, the 800-pound gorilla is what we heard from Professor Sangupta, which is that we're going to see more marine heat waves regardless. And we know it's the marine heat waves that were kind of the tipping factor that threw this whole ecological collapse into place. It doesn't mean people are not still going to be trying their best to save this ecosystem, which is such an important part, not only for the California coast and all of the creatures we love to see living in it, but also for the communities along the Mendocino and Sonoma coast and others who are so dependent on the fisheries here and the tourism that is brought in by the environment the kelp creates. It's a big story. We've just started focusing on it, and it's likely a story that will be covered in great detail for many years to come. That's this week's Weather Extra. Thanks for checking in with us.